Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. She married a beggar without knowing he was a millionaire, and what she discovers shocks everyone. In the small town of Briarwood, nestled between the peaceful hills and fragrant forests of Vermont, life moved at a slow, reassuring pace, like an old record that never skipped. The seasons had a distinct flavor. Autumn painted the streets red and gold, winter blanketed the rooftops in a muffled silence, spring brought magnolias to bloom on the alleyways, and summer brought the smells of toast, lilacs, and fresh lemonade. This was the setting in which Elena Harris lived, a 26-year-old woman, discreet but deeply rooted in the soul of this city. She had neither prestigious degrees nor a fortune to her name. No academic background, no photos of exotic travels on her walls. But what she did possess, no degree could teach: a huge heart and a quiet strength. Since she was 18, Elena had worked at Rosie's Diner, a small, family-run cafe on the corner of Main Street. With its faded neon lights, red leather booths, and walls covered in sepia-toned photographs, the place seemed frozen in the 1960s. They served coffee as black as night, pancakes at all hours, and stories were told in between orders. For the regulars, the cafe was more than a place, it was a refuge. And for many, Elena was its beating heart. Every morning, she arrived before dawn, when the streets were still empty and the shop windows were steamy with sleep. She cleaned the tables while humming softly, carefully prepared the percolator, and placed a small vase of fresh flowers on the counter, often daisies or carnations picked from her garden. She knew the first name of every regular customer, remembered who took their coffee with a drop of oat milk, or who had lost their husband in the previous year. But behind that constant smile hid a life of resilience. Elena had never left Vermont. Not because she didn't dream of it, but because life often takes you back to where you're loved, or where you're needed. Her mother, Judith, had died of breast cancer when Elena was only 15. A sweet, joyful woman, who sang her folk lullabies and stroked her hair. The loss had been brutal, silent, as if the wind had blown all the color out of their home. Her father, Walter Harris, a decorated firefighter, had given everything to the community, until a stroke left him semi-paralyzed and speechless at the age of 54. Since then, he had lived in a care facility a few miles from the city center. Elena visited him every Sunday, without fail. She would arrive with a small bouquet of sunflowers or peonies, sit beside him, and read aloud from the local newspaper, as if each article could anchor him back to the real world. She described the weather to him, the news from the cafe, the local gossip. And even though her father no longer spoke, sometimes, at the sound of a word or a memory, his eyes would mist over. That day, she stroked his hand in silence, and he squeezed her fingers, weakly, but enough so that she knew he was listening. Elena was the kind of woman you wouldn't notice at first glance. She didn't wear flashy makeup or fancy outfits. Her brown hair, always tied back in a loose bun, often carried the scent of coffee and vanilla. She walked with a hurried but gentle step, like someone who didn't want to disturb the floor. Yet, those who took the time to observe her, really, quickly realized one thing: her light didn't shine brightly, but it never went out. She never complained, even after long days spent running between tables. She gave generously, not with objects, but with attention. She brought slices of homemade pie to sad customers, listened to the old people recount their memories, and smiled at the children even when they spilled their hot chocolate. She seemed to possess a rare kindness, the kind that seeks neither recognition nor return. One autumn day, as the air grew drier and the hills around Briarwood seemed to slowly smolder in the reds, browns, and golds of the season, Elena sensed something was different. The wind swept the sidewalks like an invisible broom, making dead leaves dance in spirals around rusty streetlights. A fine mist rose from the ground, and the smell of chimneys began to mingle with the morning coffee. That day, through the large bay window of Rosie's Diner, she saw him. A man. Sitting alone on the weathered wooden bench directly across from the cafe. He hardly moved. He stood there like a piece of landscape you only notice after walking past it 1,000 times. He wore a worn military jacket, covered in stains and dust, and a threadbare gray cap pulled low over his forehead. His brown hair was a mess, tangled with faded strands, and a bushy beard hid part of his face. But that wasn't what caught Elena's eye. That was his posture. Still. Firm, but not aggressive. Resigned, but not broken. As if he wanted to disappear, without disappearing completely. He didn't reach out. He had no sign, no coin box. He didn't harass anyone, didn't whisper to passers-by. He didn't ask for anything. And perhaps it was this silence that made him more visible to Elena. The cafe's customers didn't seem to notice him. Or pretended not to. A businessman in a hurry looked away as he passed. A mother grabbed her child's hand as if to avoid unclean contact. And Elena was wiping a cup when she caught his eye through the window. Gray eyes. Cold, but alive. Distant, but not dead. She froze for a moment. She'd seen that look before. In her father's eyes, just after his stroke. That same silent pain. That need to maintain dignity in the midst of collapse. Without thinking, she returned to the kitchen. She poured some piping hot vegetable soup into a can, added a piece of still warm bread, and took a small metal spoon and slipped it into a paper bag. Before leaving, she added a rolled-up cloth napkin, just as she did for loyal customers. Nothing fancy, but everything was done with care. She stepped through the door of the cafe, braving the cool air, her cheeks a little flushed. The wind blew the tails of her jacket. She approached the bench slowly, careful not to startle the man. He didn't look at her at first. He stared at the sidewalk as if reading a secret. She stopped a meter away from him. "I've made you something hot." Her voice was soft, almost shy. She held the box out in front of her, without insisting. The man looked up slowly. His gaze fell on her, hesitant, surprised. As if he hadn't heard those words in years. He stared at the box, then at Elena's eyes. And what she saw, in that brief instant, was a mixture of wounded pride and shameful gratitude. He took the box carefully, as if it might break in his rough hands. She smiled at him, a real smile. No pity. Just warmth. "My name is Elena. If you ever need anything. I'm right here at the cafe." She jutted her chin at the Rosie's Diner sign behind her. The man remained silent for a moment. Then he lowered his head slightly. "Thanks," he said finally, in a hoarse, almost strangled voice. "I'm Ethan. Ethan Brooks." She nodded slowly, her heart strangely tight. "It's a pretty name." And without saying more, she went back to the cafe, leaving behind the smell of soup, the sweetness of a forgotten gesture, and a tiny crack in the armor of a man everyone thought was extinct. What she didn't know was that at that very moment, fate had just opened a door. Days passed. Then weeks. And every morning, like a discreet refrain, Ethan was there. Sitting on the same bench, always across from Rosie's dinner, like a silent presence that the wind couldn't carry away. He didn't come at a fixed time, but he came back. This simple daily return, this silent loyalty, already had something profound about it. He wasn't expecting anything, but he was there. Elena, for her part, had integrated this presence into her daily life. Every morning, before the cafe opened, she would prepare a soup or a small hot dish, and place it in a box with clean cutlery, a cloth napkin, and sometimes even a hastily scribbled note: "Today the sky is blue, and I hope your heart is a little too." Or, "There are gray days, but the coffee is strong. Hang in there." Ethan didn't speak much. He nodded in thanks, sometimes whispered a word, sometimes nothing. But this silence didn't bother Elena. She had that rare gift of not filling silences with nervousness. She respected them. She inhabited them calmly, as if they too had something to say. They sometimes talked about the weather, like two old people in the park. "I think autumn will be long this year." "Yes, but the maple trees will be magnificent." Other times, she told him snippets of her life, not to fill the gaps, but because she knew he was listening, even without responding. She spoke to him about her father, her childhood memories, that naive dream she had always carried: have a small garden behind a white house, plant mint and cherry tomatoes, and adopt a dog, one of those that barks too loudly but loves too loudly too. Ethan almost never answered her confidences, but every now and then, she caught a fleeting smile on his face. A rare smile, hesitant, but deep. A smile that wasn't meant to seduce, but offered silent thanks. The cafe staff, however, weren't so kind. They whispered in the back room. "You're wasting your kindness on a guy who sleeps outside. One day he'll become clingy, or worse. We don't know anything about him." But Elena didn't answer. She knew their fear stemmed from ignorance, and their judgment from discomfort. She wasn't trying to save Ethan. She wasn't telling herself stories of princesses and redemption. She was sharing what she had: respect, warmth, a gaze that didn't judge, and words that didn't dig in. One gray afternoon, as she went out as usual with her soup and still warm bread, something had changed. Ethan didn't thank her right away. He looked at her for a long time, intensely. His eyes were a little brighter than usual, as if hesitating between restraint and relief. He gently took the box, set it down beside him, and murmured in a deep, broken but clear voice. "You know, you're the first person in 2 years to look at me like a man. And not like trash." Time seemed to stand still around them. The wind grew quieter, as if it didn't want to interrupt the scene. Elena didn't answer. She didn't say, "I'm sorry," "That's not true." She did not fill the silence with banalities or misplaced compassion. She simply sat down next to him. Not too close. Not too far. Just far enough for him to feel her presence, without it weighing him down. She took a spoon out of her pocket, placed it on the box, and looked straight ahead at the leaves dancing on the sidewalk. For several long minutes, not a word was spoken. And yet, something happened. As if, in that simple act of sitting down without question, Elena had repaired a piece of something in Ethan, something long since broken. He didn't move either. He stood there, his hands on his knees, his gaze fixed on the street, but his heart suddenly felt less heavy. And that day, without them knowing it yet, silence was their first real language. Months passed. The cold had settled over Briarwood like a lid. The sidewalks had cracked under the ice, the coffee had smelled of cloves and cinnamon, and the store windows had rattled in the gusts of wind. It had been a harsh winter, the kind that tested your soul as much as your bones. And yet, in the midst of this unforgiving season, Ethan Brooks seemed to be changing. He still wore the same modest clothes, an old khaki parka, worn boots, a black cap, but his appearance had evolved. He stood straighter. His eyes were clearer. He had started shaving, unevenly at first, then with a certain discipline. He washed in the cafe's bathroom or at the nearby day-care center. And some mornings, he even looked like he'd used a little perfume. But above all, he had made himself useful. When one of the counter's neon lights flickered, he was the one who found the loose connection. When the freezer at the back made a strange noise, he was the one who reached into it. He fixed the wobbly stools, replaced the light bulbs, carried the bags of flour and the crates of milk down to the basement. He refused to be paid. "I owe this place. And her," he whispered to Rosie, the owner of the cafe, who was watching him with a suspicious but curiously tender eye. The neighborhood, initially suspicious, had changed its tone. It was no longer about that shady guy on the bench, but about the man who helps out at Rosie's dinner party. The regulars nodded at him. Some shopkeepers offered him coffee. And curious neighborhood children sometimes came to sit next to him to listen to his stories, because yes, Ethan was talking a little more now. Not much. But enough for us to sense a vast, dense, and ancient world behind his silence. And Elena, she was changing too. Her face seemed brighter. Her gestures more fluid. She laughed more, sometimes for no apparent reason. Her colleagues had noticed. "She has that look, you know, the one of people who are experiencing something real." They'd never seen Elena bring a man into her home. She didn't talk about romance, about plans for a relationship. She didn't show anything. But her heart was full. Ethan, for his part, had never declared himself out loud. He didn't say, "I love you." He showed it. He waited in the rain to walk her to the bus stop. He built her a bookshelf out of scrap wood. He even replaced the broken lock on her apartment one day when she hadn't dared ask for help. And then came that June evening. A mild, fragrant evening, after a long, hot day when the stars seemed closer than usual. The setting sun cast a golden, almost unreal light over the city. They met, as they often did, in front of the old bench where it all began. Elena had brought 2 iced teas in glass bottles. Ethan watched the leaves on the trees rustle in the breeze. He seemed nervous. And then, without saying a word, he knelt slowly, his knees in the gravel, right there, in front of the bench worn by the seasons. No ring. No prepared speech. Just the naked truth. "I have nothing to offer you, Elena." His voice was trembling a little. "No home. No assured future. No name to shine. But if you want, I can love you every day like we love the air we breathe. Unconditionally. Without interruption. Is that enough for you?" Elena stood there frozen. This moment was unlike anything she had ever imagined. There was no music, no photographers, no roses. But it was everything. Her eyes filled with tears, silent, gentle tears that flowed without pain. She placed a hand on Ethan's cheek, still a little rough despite her efforts, and said simply, "It's more than anything I ever dreamed of." He didn't get up right away. She knelt down too. And they stayed there, forehead to forehead, eyes closed, like 2 children who had finally found their secret cabin in the grown-up world. They set a date. Modest. Authentic. August 17th. A Saturday. They didn't want pomp or expensive dresses. Just a simple meal, wildflowers, an old record player, and the presence of those who truly mattered. And very quickly, the whole neighborhood was invited. Not by invitations, but by whispered words, exchanged smiles, knowing gestures. Everyone wanted to see this. Not a dream wedding. A dream wedding. The morning of the wedding. The sun had risen over Briarwood with a special gentleness that day, as if it knew a rare moment was about to occur. The light filtering through the foliage painted the town in soft golden hues. The birds seemed to sing a little louder, a little brighter. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of lilacs and the old wood of summer houses. At the small St. Mary's Church, nestled between 2 century-old maple trees, the bells had rung earlier than usual. The polished wooden pews creaked slightly under the weight of the guests, who were gradually settling in, curious, moved, and intrigued. The neighbors were there, of course. Former customers of Rosie's Diner, shopkeepers from the main street, municipal workers, retirees, mothers with their children on their laps. Even Rosie, the cafe owner, had closed for the day, something that hadn't happened in 17 years. And everyone came to see the girl from the cafe marry a beggar. At least, that's what they thought. The whisper hung like a veil in the church. That girl could have had better. She always had too big a heart. "I don't understand, she's so sweet, so hard-working." But no one said it maliciously. Rather, with a kind of incomprehension mixed with respect, even modesty. Because despite everything, everyone had seen something change in Ethan. Even without understanding. Even without knowing. Then the doors opened. Ethan walked in. 10 minutes late. And a heavy silence fell. It was not the same man. He wore a perfectly tailored, charcoal-colored 3-piece suit. A crisp shirt, understated yet elegant cufflinks, and impeccably polished black shoes. His carefully trimmed beard defined the lines of his face. His hair, swept back, revealed a calm forehead and piercing eyes. But what was most striking was his posture. He no longer walked like a man broken by cold and loneliness. He moved forward with a sure, dignified step, like a man reconciled with himself. Whispers emerged. Is that him? My God, he's unrecognizable. That guy's not a bum. Look at him. But Ethan wasn't looking at anyone, except Elena, at the end of the aisle. And she, dressed in an unpretentious ivory dress, simple but dazzling in its sincerity, stared at him with a strange emotion. A shudder, an intuition, a presentiment perhaps. She didn't understand yet, but she felt that something was approaching. They joined together beneath the nave, their hands trembling but their hearts strong. The priest murmured the opening sentences of the ceremony, but when it came to the vows, Ethan gently raised his hand. And he turned to the assembly. He took a deep breath. Then, in a firm, calm voice, and without a hint of theatricality, he said, "Before I give you my wishes, Elena, I have to tell you the truth. And all of you too." A shudder ran through the benches. Elena looked at him, her brows furrowed, worried, but she didn't move. "I'm not who you think I am. 2 years ago, I sold my company for tens of millions of dollars. I was the CEO of a Boston-based technology investment group. I was called the quiet visionary in the newspapers." A louder murmur spread. A woman involuntarily let out a "what?" The mayor, sitting in the back, sat up abruptly. Rosie opened her mouth without closing it. But Ethan continued, calm. "I had everything. Money, recognition, power. But I wasn't happy anymore. I was surrounded by people who looked at me for what I had, and not for who I was. So I left everything behind. I emptied my accounts, disappeared, changed my name. I wanted to become invisible again. To see if, one day, someone would still see me." His gaze fell on Elena. And her whole face softened. "And that's where I found you. Elena. You who offered me soup, a smile, and your voice, without ever asking questions. You looked at me when I no longer shone. When I was alone, cold, silent. And in that invisibility, I found love. True love. The only love." He took a brown folder out of his inside jacket pocket. An official document. He handed it to Elena. "Here is a deed of gift. 50% of my fortune. Not because you asked me to. Not to reward you. But because you deserved it. Through your kindness. Through your dignity. Through your gaze, which never trembled before the emptiness I had become." Elena froze, holding the file without looking at it. Her hands were shaking. Her eyes were brimming. Not because of the money. Not because of the scandal. But because deep down, she had always known. Not that secret, but that there was something about Ethan. Something rare. Precious. Broken but true. She doesn't say anything. She placed a hand on his cheek and kissed him tenderly, as if the gesture was worth more than all the words in the world. And in the church the whole assembly stood up. Some had tears in their eyes. Others had their heads bowed, ashamed of having judged. All, without exception, were shocked by what they had just seen. Not a fairy tale. But an ordinary miracle, born from a look offered without expectation. Today. Years later. Time has passed on Briarwood, but some things haven't changed. The maples still stand, proud and rugged. St. Mary's steeple still tolls every morning at 8 o'clock. Rosie's diner has changed hands, but the yellow light from its windowpanes still shines on winter evenings. And on the corner of Main Street, in front of the cafe's steamy bay window, the bench still stands. But something has changed there. Nailed firmly into the wood, lightly polished by the seasons, a brass plaque shines in the sun, discreet and solemn. This is where love saw beyond appearances. Every passerby stops for a moment. Some smile. Others wonder. A few touch it with their fingertips, like touching a memory that doesn't belong to us but inspires us. Elena and Ethan live in a modest house on the edge of the forest. Not a luxurious villa. Not a gated community. A white house with a porch, a garden filled with mint, cherry tomatoes, wildflowers, and a lazy old dog named Murphy. They could have lived in a mansion, on a private island, or in a Manhattan penthouse. But they chose something else. Simplicity. Memory. Truth. For they transformed their wealth into something living. A foundation. Created in silence. Managed with heart. It has the simplest name in the world, Foundation of the Bench. Every year, it houses, cares for, and supports dozens of homeless people. It funds temporary housing, rehabilitation workshops, support groups, and medical care. Not with a view to charity, but to restoring dignity. It is run by former beneficiaries who have become educators, by volunteers from the neighborhood. And above all, by one idea: no one deserves to be invisible. Ethan never gives interviews. He refuses to be on camera. He prefers to fix the gutters at the reception center or make coffee for the residents. He often says, "The only real luxury in this life is to be looked at without a mask." And Elena continues to love as she has always known how, with gestures. With details. With presence. Every winter, when snow gently covers the streets of Briarwood and the cafe windows light up for Christmas, she returns to sit on the bench. She keeps her hand-knitted mittens, a thermos filled with hot soup, and a rolled-up blanket at her feet. And sometimes, a stranger stops. A tired man. A wandering woman. A teenager fleeing the cold of home. She holds out the soup, still with that same frank look. And she said softly, without ever insisting, "You matter. Even if no one shows it to you yet." Some leave without answering. Others sit down. A few return. And for each, this simple gesture, this bench, this look, becomes a possible beginning. Because Elena and Ethan's story wasn't just a love story. It was a silent lesson. That one can be born in the shadows, fall into the street, disappear from the eyes of the world. But sometimes all it takes is a sincere look for everything to start again.